Hey friends, Ross here with a quick announcement. The 2024 Listener's Choice category of the Australian Podcast Awards is now live and closes in October. So if you really enjoy listening to I Was Only Doing My Job, please head over to australianpodcastawards.com/voting and vote for the podcast. And thanks.
Australia's military history is more than just a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who have answered the call of their country of birth or adoption and the enduring legacy they have created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History, a Doc Network podcast. Now let's get started.
G'day friends and welcome to episode 70 of the podcast recorded on the 22nd of September 2024. Now, a few things have happened since the last episode, so let's get this housekeeping out of the way. Firstly, you may notice my voice is a little different. That is because the seasonal change has happened and taken my voice with it. But what I've also done is updated all the episodes' titles to align to the same format. This was done to maintain consistency going forward, but let me know what you think, which version is better. You also may have noticed that episode 65, The Soldier of Three Wars, Henry Armstrong Lacey, has reappeared in your podcast feed. This is actually because I was contacted by the grandson of Henry Lacey, and the following 45-minute conversation that we had resulted in a much more accurate telling of Lacey's life, service, and legacy. I also have an update on the previous episode. As you may recall, it was the life, service, and legacy of Private Claude Roberts. I've actually been informed by Christine that her family played the episode to Claude's surviving nieces at the cemetery where Morty and Claude's parents are buried. The podcast also ranked in Belgium at number 201, so thank you, Belgium. If you are in that country, please let me know what you think of the podcast. And we also received a new review from Aussie Radar. Quote, absolutely brilliant podcast. Each episode goes into great detail about the subject. Ross loves sharing the stories from Australia's military history. So thanks, Radar. I really appreciate it. Now, for the rest of you, please check out our website and web store, www.thedocnetwork.net. We have a new Armoured Emu Brigade patch available for purchase, as well as the next run of the morale patch currently in the way. If you want to support the podcast, the best thing you can do is leave a review like Aussie Radar did on your favorite podcast player, as it tells the algorithm that that podcast needs to be heard. And with that done, let's get started. Herbert Frank Slade was born on the 19th of June 1913 to Herbert Slade, a ship's steward, and Winifred Cresswell of Penarth, a town in the Vale of Glamorgan, Wales. Going primarily by his middle name Frank, he was the eldest of three children to the family. Not a great deal is known about his early childhood, save that at some point the family moved to Bristol, where he attended the Clifton School and received his intermediate certificate. In 1928, at the age of 15, Slade came to Australia by himself as part of the youth migration program known as the Big Brother movement. Occasionally during the course of my research for these episodes, I stumble across something that I had no previous knowledge of, and while the history of youth migration to Australia from Britain between 1925 and 1983 resides well outside the scope of this podcast, the ensuing deep dive I inevitably did into the topic did, however, shed some light to a number of the questions I had in my research of Herbert Slade, namely what happened when he came to Australia. The Big Brother movement was, in a nutshell, the most successful and enduring of the youth migration organisations, and came to be after discussions between British and Australian business leaders in 1923 to encourage, by way of sponsorship, boys aged between 14 to 18, known as quote-unquote little brothers, to migrate to Australia to predominantly work in rural areas under the assistance of quote-unquote big brothers, usually recruited from service organisations such as the Royal Agricultural Society, Rotary, the Return Services League, and the Chamber of Commerce. They were usually city business and professional men and of the same religion as the quote-unquote little brother, whom they promised to assist. The big brother was ultimately responsible for the boy's welfare and would act as the proverbial foster father to him until the little brother was placed into suitable employment. After that, the member was supposed to keep in touch with the boy until they turned 21. Prospective little boys needed to provide a formal school leaving certificate and references from upstanding members of their community. They also had to sign a contract in which they promised to always obey their big brother, work hard, not drink or gamble, avoid bad company, not leave any employment within a year, write to their parents once a month, visit church, open a bank account to save money, and donate, quote, 12 shillings a year to a welfare fund, unquote. The basis of the Big Brother movement, according to one of its biggest agents, British agent to Australia, Banks Emery, was that it, quote, set conditions that would attract a better class of boy to Australia, a boy who had been brought up in a better class of home, and who had up till the moment not been induced to leave Britain in any numbers. The boys for whom the Big Brother movement was out to cater for were the type who obtained commissions during the war by promotion from the ranks. No previous scheme has been sufficiently attractive to middle-class parents, unquote. Now, there is no mistake that in the mind of the founders of this program that the better class of boy was middle-class, white, British, and Anglican. However, the repealing of the Immigration Restriction Act in 1959 and the dismantling of the White Australia policy by 1966, the election of a Labor government in 1972, and the termination for preference for British immigrants to Australia, which followed, saw the end to the program. Gradually, the Big Brother movement ceased to recruit young British migrants and was transformed into a service organisation with a social club's role that still exists to this day. When Frank Slade arrived in Sydney in June 1928, he was immediately sent to a rural station property in Bourke in the northwest of New South Wales, roughly 800 kilometres from Sydney, to work as a labourer. Because of his age at the time, it is virtually impossible to chart his movements after his arrival, save that he worked at a number of stations in rural New South Wales. This issue persists until the 1935 election, when the now 22-year-old Slade appears to have moved to Trangie, a small town near Dubbo in central western New South Wales, roughly 304 kilometres from Sydney, where he worked as a station hand. This is the first time he appears on official documents. Sometime around the outbreak of the Second World War, Slade, according to his enlistment paperwork, had moved to Darlinghurst in Sydney, where he worked as a bush worker and transport driver, though according to articles written about him during the war, he was also a New South Wales public works contractor who occasionally ventured north to Queensland. Slade would enroll into the Royal Australian Air Force Reserve in Nyngan, not far from Trangie, on the 19th of October 1940, before formally enlisting to the Royal Australian Air Force in Sydney the following year on the 20th of July. At the age of 28, and was assigned to the No. 2 Recruit Training Centre to conduct his initial training, where he was classified A1 fit for full flying duties. Slade was promoted to leading aircraftman on the 11th of October 1941 before being posted to No. 8 Elementary Flying Training School at Narrandera, New South Wales for 2 months training, and then on to No. 6 Service Flying Training School at Malala, South Australia for an additional 4 months. And in doing so, gained his flying badge on the 2nd of April. He would go on to be promoted to sergeant on the 30th before departing for overseas service on the 16th of June 1942 aboard the transport ship Rumutaka to serve as part of the Empire training scheme. Unlike the other pilots whose life, service and legacy I've already covered in the podcast who joined the Royal Australian Air Force or Royal Air Force as fighter pilots, Slade joined as a bomber pilot. The Empire Air Training Scheme, known as the EATS, was a policy designed to train Royal Australian Air Force pilots for eventual transfer to the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. The policy was envisioned after it was determined that Britain alone was unable to supply enough pilots and aircraft for the Royal Air Force to fight in the air war over Europe. In Australia, the scheme would also eventually branch out to provide the training of pilots for deployment into the Pacific War. Slade transited to the United Kingdom via the Panama Canal and disembarked on the 25th of August. While there, he was selected for further training as part of No. 14 Pilot Advanced Flying Unit at RAF Station Ossington, Nottinghamshire, on the 11th of September. He would go on to No. 81 Operational Training Unit at RAF Station Whitworth Heath on the 17th of November, and would be trained on the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley medium bomber. While there, he would express an interest in joining the elite Pathfinder Force. And while he wouldn't be initially successful, he was selected to join No. 1656 Heavy Conversion Unit on the 20th of March 1943. This prepared him for the mechanical complexities of the newly developed 4-engined heavy bombers, such as the Short Stirling, the Avro Lancaster, and the Handley Page Halifax. These heavy conversion units were trained in late 1941 to qualify crews trained on medium bombers to gain experience in operating heavy bombers prior to an assignment to an operational training unit. For Slade, his appointment to No. 1656 HCU on the 20th of March 1943 at RAF Station Lindholm would see him trained first on the 4-engine Halifax, and then he would progress onto the aircraft that has become synonymous with the Bomber Command Offensive, the Avro Lancaster. Owing to the obvious technical complexities and differences of piloting multi-engine bombers compared to single-engine fighters, it should be of no surprise that Slade had spent the better part of a year learning to fly since joining up in 1941, while the other RAF pilots I've covered are already in the thick of fighting within months of joining up. After nearly 400 flight hours and over a year of training, Flight Sergeant Herbert Slade would finally be posted to RAF Station Binbrook as part of No. 103 Squadron RAF on the 21st of April 1943, before moving on to 101 Squadron RAF a month later. During an interview conducted during the war, Slade revealed he did no operational flying until the 8th of July 1943, when he transferred for a third and final time, and his initial wish upon arriving in the United Kingdom was granted, and he was assigned to No. 156 Squadron, one of the original squadrons of the elite Pathfinder Force of the Royal Air Force, based at RAF Station Witton, a village in Cambridgeshire. If there was any reason why he didn't fly before this, it has since been lost to history. Now, when I first started writing this episode back in 2022, namely because everything I had read about the RAF's Pathfinder Force was that it was an elite unit. In fact, the only elite unit of the Royal Air Force was that it was comprised solely of veteran and experienced crews, and Slade's lack of operational flying experience raised more questions than answers, which is the reason why it took so long to actually finish this episode. Fortunately, I was finally able to get an answer, thankfully, by way of Shane Casey, Senior Curator, and Dr. Lachlan Grant, Senior Historian at the Australian War Memorial. While yes, the Pathfinder Force comprised of experienced air crews who volunteered or were persuaded to join, they were issued special patches and badges denoting their membership as a Pathfinder. The elite status came from their specialization, not due to any entry requirement. And in fact, they weren't the only elite force. There were several others in the Bomber Command. At the commencement of the Second World War, the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command initiated a campaign of precision daylight bombing against German targets. However, the lack of adequate fighter coverage led to heavy losses of the lumbering, lightly armed British bombers, with minimal returns. This prompted a switch from daytime precision bombing to nighttime area bombing of German cities. Although night bombing reduced exposure to enemy fighters, it was understood that identifying and accurately attacking targets would be far more difficult. As a result, the night bomber force was primarily effective against large targets, such as cities, one of the reasons why daylight bombings had initially been preferred. Bomber Command pressed ahead with the night bombing campaign in 1940. While crews often reported successful operations, they were instructed to return to base if they lost their way or were unable to identify the target due to weather conditions. They were to press on only if confident they could accurately identify the target. However, reports soon began reaching the United Kingdom from ground observers indicating that bombers were often never even heard over the supposed targets, let alone dropping bombs in the correct areas, even with crews reporting successes. Initially, these reports were dismissed, but after complaints from other branches of the service, an inquiry, the unfortunately named Butt Report, was commissioned. The report, published in the 18th of August 1941, revealed troubling findings. Of the aircraft that managed to reach their targets, less than one-third of crews dropped their bombs within the vicinity of the target, and in fact, less than 1% of all bombs dropped landed near their intended targets at all. The report coincided with the release of the controversial dehousing paper by the Viscount Frederick Lindemann, which advocated for the mass area bombing of German cities to break the morale of the population. Ironically, this idea was proposed while the Luftwaffe was bombing British cities but failing to break the spirit of the British people, something that I've to this day never been able to get my head around. The fact that Germany wasn't breaking the morale of British citizens by bombing them, why did Bomber Command think that they would break the German? To address some of the issues with navigation and bombing accuracy, both the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe began experimenting with equipping select aircraft groups with the newly developed highly experimental radar technology, as well as high-frequency radio transmitters. For the RAF, this led to the creation of the Pathfinders. These specialist crews were tasked with locating and marking targets during night bombing operations over Europe, using target indicator flares to illuminate the targets. The master bomber in the main force would then use these markers to more accurately aim, improving the overall accuracy of the bombing operations. The other requirements for pilots who requested to be assigned to the Pathfinders was that they were required to complete 45 operational sorties, though most volunteered and did more. As the number of operations increased, the air crew's odds of surviving were radically reduced, and without any doubt, regardless of their skills or professionalism, the key factor in surviving was simply luck and chance. And if anything, when Slade presented to RAF Station Warboys, situated just outside the village of Warboys in Huntingdonshire, now Cambridgeshire, Herbert Frank Slade was incredibly lucky. For all the flying that Slade didn't do in 101 and 103 squadrons, he definitely made up for it in 156, flying 59 missions over 2 tours from July 1943 to August 1944. Following spending July 1943 undergoing training with the squadron, his first operational flight was the 2nd of August on a raid on Hamburg. This was followed by raids on German, Italian, and occupied French cities, either directly participating in the bombing mission, serving as a decoy by having groups of bombers fly along the bomber route before breaking off towards a different target to confuse German rangefinders, night fighters, and radar, assisting with the main bomber force by dropping target indicated flares which, quote, hung in the air like dazzling bunches of grapes, unquote, to aid in target recognition, and also serving as either the master bomber or his deputy, responsible for the accurate navigation of the stream from the moment they left Allied airfields in the United Kingdom to over the target to make sure the maximum number of bombs reached the target and dropped as closely as possible on that target. By the end of August would see Slade promoted to warrant officer after his 6th operational flight over Milan, where the outer engine of his Lancaster caught fire over the target but, quote, fire drill most effective, unquote, allowed him to get his Lancaster home. On the 18th of September 1943, Slade qualified for his Pathfinder Force badge. As a Pathfinder, Slade was flying almost every day with several operations over Axis territory per week, intermixed with training and exercises. Some of these missions were against heavy flak in opposition, and Slade's Lancaster bomber came back with damage. In October 1943, flights over Hanover and Leipzig were beset with challenges as the Lancaster's N Nuts' oxygen supply failed and members of his crew became unconscious from hypoxia. On the 14th of December 1943, Slade was promoted to flight lieutenant, and following one of 3 remaining operations of the year, where he flew over Berlin, he would receive the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation read, quote, one night in December 1943, Flight Lieutenant Slade captained an aircraft detailed to attack Berlin. When nearing the target, the aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire, but although his aircraft suffered much damage, this officer completed the attack and bombed the target with great accuracy. His effort was typical of the determination he has always displayed. Flight Lieutenant Slade has completed very many sorties and has achieved much success, unquote. For the first half of 1944, Slade flew relatively few combat missions with the 156, with only 10 flights over German and French targets from January to May, culminating in Slade's promotion to acting squadron leader on the 6th of May, 1944. June 1944, however, would make up for that as he would captain his Lancaster N Nuts, the one ship that he would pilot almost exclusively during his time during 156 Squadron, on 6 consecutive missions in and around the Normandy coastline, targeting fortifications, staging areas, and airfields. In July, as the operational tempo of the war was shifted and the Allies went on the offensive, Slade and the rest of 156 Squadron was no different as they flew operations in support of the build-up and eventual breakout of Allied forces from the beachhead. On one operation at the end of July 1944, when he was captain of N Nuts on an attack on Hamburg, during the bombing run, the aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire, which damaged a 48 square foot section of the port wing that included the port aileron, which made flight operations difficult. Despite this, Slade was able to maintain a level course and regain some measure of control to allow his bomb aimer to drop ordnance on target. It would seem that once that happened, he lost control of the plane and it started to spiral out of control and lost height rapidly. Slade then ordered his crew to don their parachutes while he tried to retain control of the aircraft. In his report of his actions where, quote, I had elevator control and managed to lift the nose and bring speed back to 155 knots, still in spiral, I applied course right rudder, extra power on port side, 2650 plus 8, and with rudder and motor, lifted aircraft onto even keel, still without aileron control, unquote. Finally able to regain control, he was now faced with the return journey back to England, and while his engines still worked, the ailerons were not responding and a visual inspection of the port wing showed a huge section torn back and sticking up in the air, slowing the aircraft and affecting its performance. When approaching the coast, Slade was once again heavily engaged by German flak, forcing him to throw the plane around, and in doing so, actually managed to shear the projecting piece of wing, which allowed him to regain some measure of control of the aircraft. Because his port wing was damaged, he relied very heavily on his starboard rudder to maintain balance and while also bleeding fuel from the port fuel tank to lighten the load. Crossing the British coast, in his report, Slade remembered, quote, as engines were okay, I decided to make for Woodbridge and gave the navigator necessary instructions. We kept about 25 miles from the enemy coast in case of emergency, when we would have to make an emergency landing. I then ordered a bombing check, but found that the 4 TIs and 2 times 1000 MC bombs were still hung up, unquote. TI, its target indicator flares, which were incendiaries used by Pathfinders to assist in night bombing, and the 1000 MC bomb was a 1,000-pound medium-capacity, high-explosive general-purpose munition that was the mainstay of the bomber force. Slade was unwilling to dump the remaining munitions as it would have forced him to leave the bomb bay doors open, which would have caused too much drag and a loss of altitude. As Slade brought N Nuts in for a landing, the port tire that had been barely holding on following damage from anti-aircraft fire burst, which caused what was left of the port wing to drop and dig into the ground, swinging the plane onto its other landing gear, which also collapsed under the strain. Then N Nuts skidded off the runway on its belly for 150 yards before finally coming to a stop. Slade and his crew unsteadily climbed out of the airframe, thankful the bombs didn't explode, and the plane remained otherwise intact, although it would be its last flight, as N Nuts in 156 Squadron was written off. But she did her job. The crew emerged unscathed. Now, as the story goes, Slade was awarded the Distinguished Service Order right on the tarmac, though he would actually be invested with the honour in Buckingham Palace on the 13th of November 1945. Acting Squadron Leader Herbert Frank Slade would be assigned to the 801st/492nd Bomb Group, the Carpetbaggers of the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force at Harrington, England, on the 10th of November 1944 to serve as a liaison officer tasked with training B-24 Liberator crews with night bombing tactics. He conducted, quote, countless lectures and practical demonstrations in the air, unquote. One of the duties that the 492nd also undertook was the deployment of agents of the Office of Strategic Services into occupied Europe, the precursor of the CIA. Slade made an immediate impression on the young US Army Air Force pilots, all of whom were either fresh out of high school or undergraduates at university, who must have been like children compared to the 31-year-old Slade. When Lieutenant George Winburn, the only American pilot to take Slade on an operational mission, recalled in a 1990 compilation of stories titled They Flew by Night, that his perception of Slade was that he was in awe of him as he was a survivor of 200 raids, and that he owned a sheep ranch in Australia, and he was older and then he was quiet, always dressed in his RAF blue uniform. Now, I'm not entirely sure where Winburn got the impression that Slade had conducted 200 raids, as the RAF only recorded operational flights as missions that were completed over enemy territory, or the fact that he owned a sheep ranch is also news to me, as all accounts he was either a transport driver or a New South Wales Public Works contractor. On the 21st of January 1945, Slade would join Winburn's crew as a co-pilot on a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber, and after a rough instruction on the instrumentation, though according to Winburn, Slade was not impressed when compared to his beloved Lancaster, especially when the Liberator failed to start. After Winburn's crew managed to get the engines to start, they were now the last plane to leave, and by that time, they got to the end of the runway and waited for clearance to take off. After receiving that clearance, to Winburn's horror, he realized he hadn't conducted a pre-flight check while dealing with the engine troubles and had difficulty initially getting off the ground. And as they climbed, Slade apparently visually checked anything but never touched any controls. For the return flight after completing the operation, Slade continued to not be impressed with the Liberator, especially as the front windscreen started to freeze up and had no way to automatically clear the screen. Winburn had to actually scrape it off by hand. After this, things only managed to get worse for them when they were informed that the landing field was also covered in ice. According to Winburn, Slade was furious and allegedly went on a swearing spree that cowed both Winburn and the rest of his crew that only stopped when Slade left the plane and to go and change out of his flight suit at a completely different building to the rest of the crew. This would be the last operational flight of Squadron Leader Herbert Frank Slade. While he would stay on with the 492nd until March and would be flying daily, it would only be domestically, and despite his declaration to never fly a Liberator again, he would fly in 2 more times. For his service in the 492nd, he would also be awarded the Bronze Star, the third highest award in the United States system of awards. The citation read, quote, for meritorious service as liaison officer with the United States Army Air Force Heavy Bombardment Group from 10th November 1944 to 15th April 1945. By countless lectures and practical demonstrations in air and on combat missions, Squadron Leader Slade instructed crews in night bombing tactics in the spirit of teamwork which is necessary to success. The results of his authoritative instruction have been of great value to the work of the bombardment group and the Allies' war effort, unquote. On the 25th of May 1945, Slade would go on to lead the RAF contingent at the Empire Day pageant at the Royal Albert Hall, and following his time with the United States Army Air Force on the 21st of April 1945, Slade was assigned to the number 11 RAF Personnel Dispatch and Reception Center at the Metropole Hotel in Brighton as he awaited reassignment. 2 days later, Slade would be assigned to overseas RAF headquarters in London, and after the war he would work with the Historical Records section at Australia House, tasked with collecting a representative range of war material for the then newly opened Australian War Memorial. The end of September 1946 would see Slade assigned to the number 33 Personnel Reception Centre while he awaited transport back to Australia. He boarded the transport home on the 12th of October that year and finally returned to Australia on the 13th of December. After a month of leave, Squadron leader Herbert Slade, having reverted to his substantive rank of flight lieutenant, reported to RAF Eastern Area Headquarters at Bradfield Park at the start of 1947, where he would be demobilised after 5 years and 192 days active service. After the war, Slade would resettle in the Harden, Boorowa area, and on the 26th of February 1949, he would marry Lorna Mary Starr in a small ceremony at the St Paul's Church of England in Murrumburra. The couple would welcome 2 sons, Colston and Gilbert, not long afterwards, and on the 11th of May 1941, Slade would open Slade's Motors on the corner of Court and Bryall Street in Boorowa. Now, as I was researching this episode, I actually did drive out to Boorowa as there were some gaps in my research, and I stood in that intersection at the former site of his dealership. And the following year, he'd opened another one in Harden. Slade would sell Standard and Triumph cars and Ferguson system tractors and equipment and boasted 2 certified mechanics, and not long after opening the dealership, he would also have 2 curbside petrol Bowsers. Slade would make a name for himself in the district, routinely showing off the latest in Standard Vanguard cars and Ferguson tractors at the Boorowa show and supporting the local rugby club from 1951 to 1954. The passion for motoring extended to his participation in reliability tests of the Triumph Mayflower in 1952, when it was driven around the entire state of New South Wales, some 2,517 miles, over the course of 55 hours non-stop, and 10 drivers proudly proclaiming that the engine ran non-stop even when refueling and changing drivers. Slade drove the car from the New South Wales Victorian border town of Albury to Cooma, just south of Canberra, and apparently thought very highly of it. This interest in motoring was passed on to his son Gil, who would go on to compete in club-level car racing, and this legacy would be inherited by Herbert's grandson, Tim Slade, who currently races in the V8 supercars in the Premium Air Racing team. By 1957, Flight Lieutenant Herbert Slade, DSO, DFC, US Bronze Star, had relocated the family to a soldier settlements block in Barradine in central New South Wales, where he named Cresswell. It would be here that he lived out the remainder of his life, when on the 13th of September 1962, he would pass away from cancer. He was cremated at the Northern Suburbs Crematorium in North Ryde, where his ashes were interred. He's also commemorated on the Bourke and District War Memorial. He was 49 and survived by his wife and 2 sons. And there you have it, folks. That is the life, service, and legacy of acting squadron leader Herbert Slade, a man whose quiet determination and sense of duty carried him from the rural stations of New South Wales to the skies over war-torn Europe and back. His journey was one of courage, resilience, and service, both during the war and in the years that followed. Now, I've spent the better part of 2 years piecing together his story. I even drove out to Boorowa to stand where Slade once stood. I even recorded footage from where the site of Slade's Motors once stood, and in doing so, I filled in the gaps of his remarkable life. It's been a long road, but one that I felt needed to be done properly. Men like Herbert Slade deserve more than a fleeting mention in history. They deserve to be remembered as they truly were. People who returned from war with more than medals, but with the determination to build new lives and serve their communities. Now, I'd also like to thank Helen McGrath from the Boorowa Historical Society. Helen lived in Boorowa when Slade was there and does remember Slade's Motors, his post-war business. Her insights were invaluable in helping to bring this part of his life to light. Slade was more than a squadron leader, more than his distinguished service medals, more than his 59 operational missions. He was a husband, a father, and a man who continued to serve his community long after the fighting ended. Standing in Boorowa, where he opened his car dealership, I could feel the weight of his history. A man who didn't stop doing his duty once the war was over. And for that, we are eternally grateful. Works cited in this episode were the website of number 156 Squadron RAF, 492nd Bomb Group from the American Air Museum. Lancaster pilots survived numerous scrapes from the Department of Veterans Affairs Anzac Portal. The 801st 492nd Bomb Group from the Harrington Aviation Museum. They flew by night from the 801st 492nd Bomb Group Association. The Pathfinder Craig website. Trove, the online newspaper archive of the National Library of Australia. The New South Wales Department of Birth, Deaths and Marriages. The collection related to the service of Herbert Slade stored at the Australian War Memorial. The service record of Herbert Slade from the National Archives of Australia. Adelaide V8 driver Tim Slade dedicates Anzac Day race to World War II veteran grandfather by Scott Walsh. MyHeritage.com, New South Wales Marriage Index from 1788 to 1966, and the website of the Australian War Memorial.
I was only doing my job, and the Australian Military History Podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support from each and every one of you, but especially to the members of our Armoured Emu Brigade community. Now, if you want to continue the conversation or suggest a topic for a future episode, you can do so on all our social media channels. At this point, the podcast is on everything under @IWODMJ. Links to everything are in the show description. If you want to join the Armored Emu Brigade community, you can also do so on our Discord server. The invite link to that is on the episode description and on the podcast website, www.thegdocnetwork.net. There you can find also show notes, transcripts, and photos of my various travels that are locating the myriad of memorials dotted around Australia. If you like what I do here on the podcast and want to directly support the work that I do, you can either buy the podcast a one-off coffee or support us on Patreon for exclusive podcasts, interviews, and giveaways. Each cent raised goes directly into improving the podcast, from digitization of service records and the purchasing of reference material to the distribution and licensing of each and every piece of content. But the best thing you can do is rate this episode on your platform of choice, leave a review, or share it with a friend. It's the easiest way to show your support and get the show into the ears of people who need to hear it. Thanks for listening to I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military history podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, whose elders have passed on knowledge for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This podcast is mostly a one-man show, with me doing the writing, researching, recording, audio engineering, and directing, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. All opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not represent the opinions or views of any agency, entity, or organization. It is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. And until next time, friends, catch you then. Bye!